Welcome into a brand new episode of the Whole Story Podcast. On today's episode, Dave O'Brien, TV play-by-play voice of the Boston Red Sox. Dave, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. How are you holding up during this such an unprecedented time?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Great to be with you. And it is such a bizarre time. And you're probably in the same boat I am, where you wake up every morning and that's what you say. Oh my God, is this a weird, bizarre, strange time? And your thoughts immediately go to the people who have been deeply affected. I have friends who have contracted the coronavirus and have recovered. I know family members who did not. My own son had to be tested for it about 2 weeks ago because he was having some of the symptoms. It's a very, very, very scary time. My oldest daughter, Samantha, who's also in broadcasting, lives in San Francisco. They've been on lockdown for about 5 weeks, about longer than anybody. So, your heart goes out to, the first responders and the doctors and the nurses who are right there on the front line, and people who work in, let's not forget people who work in grocery stores and put, they're putting themselves on the line every day. But think to yourself, 6 weeks ago, could you ever believe that, 300 million Americans would all be thinking about the same thing every single day? That's extraordinary. And I tend to take a very optimistic and positive view. I think that we will get back to normal sooner than later. But boy, it's a frightening time for everybody. And I hope you're doing well in your family as well, as well as everybody else.
I started this podcast just a few weeks ago in hopes that it gives people the time to just break away and to think about baseball or to think about something other than what's happening around the world, just a little breakaway. So let's jump into it, talk about your career. It's been an interesting turn for sure the last couple of weeks with no sports, and sports is a part of your DNA. And I know this time last year, it's hard to think about, but right around this time, we were actually together in the broadcast booth at Fenway, but now no one is there during this time. And you look back at it, and a lot of people may not know this, but during the baseball offseason, you're not just sitting at home, you're working with ESPN, calling college basketball. So now with no sports, it must be a little challenging for you right during this time.
It's challenging is one good word for it. And, we all tend to then kind of look at ourselves and what's happening in our own lives. And you mentioned it, baseball is in my DNA. This is going to be my 30th year in a major league broadcast booth. So it gets into your blood. And we had already been at spring training. I had already called a handful of spring training games. We were already into the rhythm of spring, and then soon enough what was going to be the regular season opener on March 26th, which of course never happened. But right now the Red Sox are supposed to be on the West Coast. We're supposed to be out there playing West Coast teams, and about 3 weeks into the baseball season. So I did a broadcast thing today with Dennis Eckersley and Jerry Remy, my broadcast partners on New England Sports Network, and Eck was saying, it's hard to get into talking about baseball right now because it feels so far away when it's supposed to be right there. I should be leaving for the ballpark, any minute to get down to Fenway Park to call on a typical day like this, to call a game at 7:00 at night, or if I'm on the road, I'd be on my way to the park any minute. And, that rhythm is gone. And baseball is very much a rhythm sport because you play every single day. And I always look at the season as every month is a new chapter in the book on that season. And all of those seasons are so unique. And every chapter is so special. No one's reading that book right now.
You mentioned the rhythm that baseball is. The broadcasters are affected by this, but also the players. How do you think, because it takes a couple of weeks, it takes the at-bats, it takes the innings that the pitchers are pitching to get into their own rhythm. How long do you think it will, once the baseball season begins this year, again, thinking optimistically, how long do you think the spring training 2.0 is going to have to be realistically for the broadcasters and the players to get back into that rhythm that you were just talking about?
Yeah. For broadcasters, it takes 2 innings, but for players, it takes much, much longer, of course. And, The standing line seems to be 3 weeks. Nothing short of that. Doesn't have to be longer because they've already had a version of spring training, and guys are already have during the pandemic, they have been hitting and they've been doing some throwing, not large groups or anything like that, but most of them have the ability to do that either at their own homes or a local school, university, high school, whatever. They can get on a mound and work with somebody. That's proper. 60 feet, 6 inches is good social distancing, So if you're going to throw. So I think 3 weeks makes sense whenever we can get back and players can be game ready in that span. I don't think it would require much longer than that. Some players would disagree. A lot of pitchers would disagree. But I think these are different times. You don't want to risk injury, but I really don't think you are if you get that amount of time. Certainly for the hitters, it'll be easier. The pitchers are going to lag behind, but that would be my best bet.
Mm-hmm. Let's get into your career. You said this would be your 30th year in an MLB broadcast booth. Looking back at it, and I know we talked about this last year when we were at Fenway Park together, and we were looking over the stadium and the Green Monster in the background, and you went to Fenway with your dad as a kid. Did you ever think you would be sitting here right now, 30 years later, as an MLB broadcaster?
Well, I at that point, when my dad would take me to games, like so many New England kids, going with their pop or going with their brothers, with their Little League teams or their Boy Scout troops, as I did, growing up in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts. I was born in Boston, born in the same hospital Senator Ted Kennedy was born in, actually, and grew up in Quincy and then the South Shore of Massachusetts. When you begin to think, what might I do? What is it I love? What are my parents encouraging? What are my teachers saying? I was probably 11, 12 years old before the idea of being a broadcaster popped into my head. And I can remember looking, from where we were sitting, my dad and my brothers and I, 3 brothers, and we would all go to Fenway together. I remember looking back into the broadcast booth and seeing the lights on in the television booth and asking my dad what was going on there. And he said, well, those are the announcers that are getting ready for the game. Those are the guys you watch on TV or listen to on the radio. And I think I spent more time that day or that night watching the broadcast booth than watching what the Sox were doing on the field at Fenway, because it was fascinating that, you could be paid to go to Fenway Park, not pay, but be paid to be there, and they feed you in the press box. And this is what you get to do. And I got to tell you, Alex, probably 4 or 5 times this summer, to this day, before I go on the air, I will look out and take in that scene at Fenway Park, and it all rushes back to me. I feel like an 8-year-old kid again, or a 10 or 12-year-old kid again, because it's such a special place. We like to say it's the best ballpark in America, and we're partial to it. We grew up here, but I've been to every park, and I've been to many parks that have since closed. There's no better place to see a baseball game than Fenway Park on the face of the earth. And I know that, Yankee fans might say that about, no, they wouldn't say that about Yankee Stadium. This one's still pretty new, The old one was something else. This one's pretty antiseptic. But, Wrigley's great. Dodger Stadium's phenomenal. But Fenway, and I'm fortunate because I feel like I grew up there. I learned my baseball chops at Fenway. It's the best, and it's not even close.
And I feel like every park has its own uniqueness about it. You go to Yankee Stadium expecting one thing. You go to Fenway expecting something. Wrigley, Oracle Park, they all are special in their own way. But you mentioned getting the food at Fenway. There's nothing better than some popcorn, right?
But, I work with Jerry Remy, and the Rem Dog before every game gets a big thing of popcorn. He's got to have that. For me, I've always been a Fenway Franks guy, so that's a couple of those, and I'm in heaven. But to each his own. And in recent years, you could get lobster rolls at Fenway. When I was a kid, forget it. It was popcorn or it was a hot dog, and that was it, and that was fine. It was more than enough. That and a Coke, and you were in great shape. But it's amazing how these ballparks have, to the point where you can eat. I mean, in Seattle, you can eat grasshoppers, with garlic salt or whatever they put on them to try to make them edible. They're atrocious, but I mean, it's incredible what you can eat at the ballpark. A lot of people will walk away going, yeah, I don't really know what happened in the game, but I can tell you what I had in the second inning and the fourth inning and the sixth inning to eat. That's how it is these days. And the vast array of, beers and craft foods, pretty amazing today.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking before we started recording this. I'm in upstate New York, Albany area, about 2.5 hours away from Syracuse University, the most prestigious sports broadcasting school in the country, one of them. Why Syracuse?
Well, I mean, that'd be a two-parter because, for me, I know I went to Syracuse for exactly that reason, because Bob Costas and Marv Albert had gone, Dick Stockton had gone to Syracuse. And then, I went to school with Mike Tirico and Sean McDonough and a half dozen other guys who have gone on and done some amazing things in broadcasting. And it was the place, and remains, for my money, the place to go if you want to be on the air and you want to be a sports announcer, or you want to be a play-by-play person. There's no better laboratory than the Carrier Dome on a Saturday afternoon with 30,000 people in the stands, and you're doing the play-by-play on WAER radio, the student radio station, where all of those guys I just talked about called games at one point, as I did, starting out with a tape recorder in my lap, with my partner next to me, and trying to balance the tape recorder, the microphone, and the game notes, and call the game in a sea of students around you. That's how you earned your way onto WAER radio. The very first game I ever called, play-by-play wise, was Patrick Ewing and John Thompson in the Carrier Dome against Pearl Washington and the Syracuse Orange of Jim Boeheim, 35,000 people. And at one point, John Thompson had to take his team off the field because the fans had lost it. They were starting to throw things on the field. Thompson took his team off the court. And so for 10 minutes, we had to fill. And you know as well as I do, 2 minutes of fill, unscripted, is an eternity for a broadcaster, let alone 10 minutes before he finally brought them back onto the floor. So that was a great baptism of fire. You only get those experiences in a place like Syracuse, where there's a lot of competition to be on the air. Mike Tirico talks. He's told the story a couple of times. I think, it may not be true, but he said when I showed up to campus, all the other students who were vying for airtime on WEER were like, oh, God, we're never going to get on now. Listen to this guy. He sounds like he's 40 years old. Well, I didn't. I still sounded like I was about 18 or 19 years old. But I had been on the air for a couple of years in New Hampshire so that I could earn enough money to go to Syracuse. And I had a little more experience. So I sounded, more polished than some of those guys, who, by the way, turned out to be great broadcasters.
You mentioned the competitiveness that not only Syracuse has at the college level, but also the sports broadcasting industry. Once you graduate college, that competitiveness factor that goes into it doesn't just disappear, right? And you learn what that is like in college, and then once you graduate and you get into the job market, you realize, there's more of it here.
Oh, yeah.
Thinking back at your time at Syracuse, what was the most eye-opening experience that you had about this industry? Having the prior experience that you had, I'm sure you had some sort of inclination. Again, you've really known and that you wanted to do this since you were 8 years old at Fenway Park, looking up at the broadcast booth at Fenway. Now in college, you're pursuing your dreams. What was the most eye-opening experience that you had?
It was probably that pedigree, that having gone to that particular school, gone to the Newhouse School of Communications at Syracuse, worked with the people I worked with, was probably that how much that helped me. That was the eye-opener, because I was applying for jobs, but the job that I accepted, I was still a student. I had yet to graduate. It was in my senior year. They came looking for me. I didn't go looking for them. Wound up in South Carolina at a radio station and worked there for only 6 months before I jumped to Atlanta, a larger market, big station. That led to a lot of great things, including play-by-play with the Atlanta Braves. But and I was only in my mid-20s at that point. But probably the foot in the door that Syracuse will give you, because you're so well prepared when you step off that campus, and the reputation really precedes in the industry, as you've said, and you framed it very, very nicely, that it's an industry standard, and you know what you're going to get typically from a play-by-play or commentator, a graduate of Syracuse. You're going to be way ahead by the time you leave upstate New York with that degree, and I know I was, and big part of it was I had to compete with people like Sean McDonough and people like Mike Tirico and Bill Roth, who wound up at Virginia Tech for 25 years calling games, and a slew of guys like that. And the other thing that it set the table for you very nicely to be there when we had people like Bob Costas coming back to campus as speakers, and they would be very much involved with undergraduates like me and guys you could contact. I remember I had a question right after I had taken my first job out of Syracuse. I had a question about, should I accept an offer with the next step? And the first person I thought of to reach out to was Bob, who I consider the best broadcaster around, did then and still do, an amazing communicator, just incredible. But Bob responded to my letter in 4 days, and it came in an NBC envelope. And, Bob Costas, he gave me some phenomenal advice, which I treasured. I actually followed, and it worked out great for me. It was tremendous, great wisdom. But that's one of the great advantages of Syracuse, is the contacts you make and the people you wind up working with, and in some cases for, in the business.
You mentioned contacts and networking. It's one of the biggest pieces. Obviously, you need the talent. Obviously, you need a decent reel to last in the industry, but it's also who you know. And we were talking also before we started this, John Shambi was on this podcast last week, and he said he gave you a tape once and you told him, this is actually pretty good. And John joked that was the nicest thing that you said to him, kind of jokingly. He said you had a great sense of humor. And, what he did and is still doing, obviously, you have to have a passion for this. You have to have a love for what you do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it for very long. It takes a special person and a special passion to do this type of career.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's the first thing that I tell prospective broadcast students or those who are just getting into business. What do you love about it? Do you love doing this? Do you love being at the ballpark? Do you love being in the booth at a football field? And if the answer is there's nothing else I'd rather do than to be there and calling the game, then you're doing the right thing. If there's any hesitation on that at all, if you're like, well, I could see myself being an anchor on SportsCenter, I could see myself being a producer or whatever, well, then don't do this, because first of all, it requires, you mentioned the competition, it requires so much of your focus and your passion and everything you've got just to break into the business. And then if you're lucky enough, and there is a considerable amount of luck to it, if you're lucky enough to land a great job, like the first big gig I got was as a radio play-by-play man with the Atlanta Braves. When they gave me the job, I was 25. And I was walking into the booth with Skip Carey and Pete Van Wieren and Don Sutton, which was a great education unto itself. But I was just a kid. But I think overwhelmingly my passion and love, not just for baseball, but for all sports, was the single most important thing in getting me there at that time. And I'll bet you, Joe Buck would say the same thing, and Al Michaels would say the same thing, and John Shambi would say the same thing.
I had this similar conversation with Jeff Levering 2 days ago. And I asked him, he worked 10, 15 years to get to the major league level. This will be his 5th year with the Brewers. How, for you, 30 years at the major league level, how do you still make sure that you're not becoming complacent? that you're still improving every single day. You're still adding some new vocabulary, learning how not to overuse certain words, add the captions to the pictures, because obviously radio and TV are two completely different beasts within itself, whether it's radio play-by-play or TV play-by-play. 30 years at the major league level, how does Dave O'Brien not become complacent broadcasting?
Well, the guy that I think of as the template for it, and how he managed his career is beyond me, because he was in the booth for 60 years, is Vin Scully. And Vin Scully never got tired of it. Vin Scully never stopped trying to be, I think he was as close to perfect as a communicator can get, not just sports, a communicator, period. I think he's certainly one of the greatest handful, and I mean 2 or 3 pure communicators in the history of this country. Just happened to be a baseball announcer. And if Vin never got to the point where he thought he had it licked, and he never did, and he was adamant about that, then I certainly couldn't and shouldn't do that. If Doc Emmerich doesn't feel that way about hockey, I shouldn't feel that way about whatever sports that I'm doing. And you're exactly right. I think, and there are people who kind of wear down and wear out with it. Maybe they get a sense of burnout, but I look at it this way. If I come home from like a June Sox game at Fenway, Red Sox, Texas Rangers, Sox are in 3rd place. Okay. I come home at night. If there was something that occurred in that night's game that I needed to see again, or I didn't think we handled it quite the way we should have, or I wanted to see if we did it as well as I thought, if we executed it as a broadcast, if I don't go and watch it back that very evening, I'm not doing the audience a favor. I'm certainly not doing myself or the broadcast any favors. So I think if I still have that urge, that necessity to go and air check, it may not be the entire game. It may only be a couple of innings. But as long as that instinct is still in me, that means I'm still trying to improve, still hoping to get better, and hoping to deliver a better broadcast.
It's about just the overall networking that this is, not becoming complacent. What would be one thing that you kind of most love about this career? Is it just the constant day-to-day that you're watching a game, let's say it's the Red Sox versus the Tampa Bay Rays, game 1, and the next night is a completely different game?
Yeah, every game is different. People talk about that all the time. 162 games. You're on the air all the time. How does it stay fresh? Every game is different, and every athlete's performance is different from the day before. I never lose sight of this fact too, Alex, that I'm watching the best athletes in the world on the whole planet. These are the best 750 baseball players that you're going to find, okay? And they're doing it at such a high level. It's often artwork, it's athletic art. I never find that boring. I never find that dull. Baseball, as you know, is a slow, sometimes ponderous game. I get that. But oftentimes, the game is the most interesting when there's nothing happening. When the pitcher's holding the ball at the thigh, looking in for a sign, if the 8th inning and there's bases are loaded and it's a tie score and the place is going nuts, and that dugout is looking at that dugout and both bullpens are going, and you've got infielders shifting like crazy. There's so much going on that I find it. My father used to say this, baseball is only boring to people with boring minds. And I found that to be eternally true. I really do. So for me, it isn't like you walk into the booth and go, how am I going to make this interesting today? What if Rafael Devers hits 3 home runs today and drives in 14 runs? You could see a guy hit for the cycle, which happens less frequently than guys throw no-hitters. You never know what's going to happen. I've called 8 no-hitters in my career, and no 2 of them were even close to being alike, and not to mention dozens and dozens that were lost after the 7th inning when you were, churning for that moment. I was for a time I did Mets television while I was alongside doing ESPN. I just did weekends, and I worked games with Tom Seaver. So I only did like a 50-game package every year. But one of those games happened to be Tom Glavine, who was a Met for a time, the end of his career, bringing a no-hitter into the 8th inning at a time when the Mets, this was still at Old Shea Stadium, the Mets had never had a no-hitter. They've since had one, but they had not thrown a no-hitter at that time. And Glavine was getting close. He was within like 6 outs. Closest the Mets had been in a while. We checked, he lost it, but we checked the ratings the next day. And in New York City, the ratings quadrupled over the course of that, a no-hitter, over the last 2 innings. They went through the roof because people were expecting, this is the moment, it's actually going to happen. You had Met fans, baseball fans all over New York who had never seen a Met throw a no-hitter, and they could not wait to see it. So that was an example of how powerful this stuff can be, that on any given day, Tom Glavine might be that close to a no-hitter for the first time, making history, and if you're lucky enough, you're there to see it. If you're even luckier, in my opinion, you get a chance to broadcast it. So I always feel like you're lucky to be in the booth, no matter what the circumstances are, any day, and regardless of the sport, too.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned just working with great people in the booth. You obviously work with 2 great people right now, Remy and, of course, Eckersley.
Yeah.
What's kind of your favorite moment that you've had with those 2 in the booth?
Well, we've had a lot of them. That booth has become maybe the most fun I've had in a broadcast booth. And that's saying something, because with all the stuff I've been able to do, I've worked with over 250 partners. I've never worked with 2 guys individually and as a team who are as good as these guys. They're incredible. But just being in the booth with them on a regular basis is something. But Dennis Eckersley will say anything, okay? And Rem's good at putting on the brakes or trying to get him to, at least pump it a little bit. This was one of our first broadcasts as a 3-man booth. Our sideline reporter, Garen Austin, tossed it up to us, and it was something like, what was your most embarrassing moment in baseball? Something like that. And Eck jumps right into, well, I got to say, it was probably when my best friend stole my wife. when I was pitching for the Indians, and I went on a road trip, and I came home and she told me to leave the house because my best friend, who was a teammate of his, Rick Manning, was all of a sudden with Mrs. Eckersley. So he had been injured. So he went on to tell the story, but we're trying to get him to, maybe not so much personal business here, Rick, but because most people were not aware of that story. But that was probably, and we lost it, of course. We were just, on the floor. But that's working with Dennis, and that's one of the great things about working with both of those guys and together as a 3-man unit. You never know what you're going to hear. You never know where they're going to go with either a point of view or a personal anecdote, and that really makes it fun.
Yeah, this is my favorite part of this show. I know last time we did the Fast 5, you showed off your Vince Scully impression.
Yeah.
So maybe with this Fast 5, we can maybe get the responses with a Vince Scully impression. You mentioned over 250 broadcasters that you've worked with. Who's one broadcaster that you haven't worked with but would want to?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I'd really have to think about, on the baseball side, I'd love to do a game with John Smoltz. Because I've known Smoltzy for a long time. He was a young pitcher with the Atlanta Braves. My first job was with the Atlanta Braves. I was a young guy, and when they would bring up a pitcher like Smoltz, he was about the same age I was, if not a couple of years younger. Same with Tom Glavine. And I think he's developed into a phenomenal analyst. Tim McCarver was a guy I would have loved to have sat next to and picked his brain for 9 innings. I mean, I'm so fortunate because I've got 2 guys who are, in that Hall of Fame class as announcers, in my opinion. So I want for nothing in the booth these days. I've worked with, Jay Billis on hoops. I've worked with Doris Burke, who's incredible. Many, many games at Dickie V, who could not be a better human being. So I've been really, really lucky in that respect. I'll tell you, I'd answer this another way, though. A guy that I would love to have one more shot at, just one more game. He's no longer with us. He was a former partner of mine. And his name was Rick Majerus, who was a former basketball coach at Utah and also at St. Louis. And we were partnered together for 2 years. Very, very interesting man. Brilliant basketball coach. And if I had another opportunity, to work a game with Rick, I would just tell him how much I enjoyed that first go around and how much basketball he taught me.
Who was one favorite teacher or professor you had growing up?
Well, honestly, I think the best teachers for me have really been broadcasters. But there was a gentleman I worked with when I was 17 years old in New Hampshire, a little radio station in Keene, New Hampshire, WKNE. And that's the first paying broadcast job I got. I was only 17 years old. And they really took a chance at me. And I did late nights and overnights. They put me in a safe place where not many people could hear me. But I remember him telling me once, his name was Howard Corday, he was our program director. And I remember Howard pulling me aside once and saying, you've got a real sportsy sound. You better make sure that your career is in sports because that's where you belong. You sound sportsy. And he meant that as a real compliment, because he was a huge sports lover. He wanted to be a sports announcer. His career took him elsewhere. But that was probably one of the most important things a teacher ever told me or ever taught me. I mean, I had some great professors at Syracuse, but I really look to other broadcasters as great counsel for me.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
My biggest pet peeve is announcers who give up on the game too early, who will tell you in so many words, this is over. In other words, don't even bother to watch. This isn't even worth your time. And that has always rankled me. And occasionally I'll work with a partner, not the guys I work with on the Red Sox, but maybe a basketball game, and it's gotten to 17 points and only 4 minutes to go. And their tone, anyway, would lead the viewer to believe, hey, I'm going to go find something better to do. And I always think that's dangerous because I've called so many games in different sports that we thought were done, that this is going to be your final result. And it didn't end up that way, not even close. And, if you kiss a game off before it's really had time to be a final, I think you're doing your viewers a real disservice. So I try not to do that. And if I find myself going that way, there's a voice inside my head saying, don't do it.
What's your biggest fear?
In the booth?
Sure, yeah.
My biggest fear is I guess probably that I will make some basic mistake, like give the wrong score or give a guy an RBI or a home run who didn't hit it. It was our third baseman, not our shortstop. I think those are the things that drive every announcer. You're trying to be technically perfect. It's really hard to do. Even Scully couldn't pull it off every day of his life, and believe me, he'd be the first one to tell you that. But you keep coming back and trying to be perfect. But that's it. You're working on that every day. You want to make sure someone tuning into the game, either TV or on radio, they may not have been with you for the last hour and a half. So they need an accurate accounting, and they need it quickly. They need it efficiently to get caught up so that they're comfortably in the lane for the rest of the day or however long they're going to watch or listen.
What is your go-to ice cream topping?
For me, that would be whipped cream. Yeah, I'm not a nuts guy. So, I mean, I'll do sprinkles on occasion, but usually it's just the whipped cream, obviously chocolate sauce underneath there. Clearly. But, the whipped cream, that's the topping for me. Nothing too crazy, too fancy, but, delicious nonetheless.
Vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream?
I'm a big chocolate ice cream guy.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm vanilla.
Yeah.
I'm vanilla.
hey, to each his own. And, people would look at us and go, oh, that's boring, No, it's not.
Right.
It's all American is what it is,
So I know we started this Vince Scully impression. Do you have any other hidden talent that Dave O'Brien might have that no one might know about?
Yeah, I think so. And people have told me that there was a long period of time where I thought I was going to be a sports writer because I can write. I like to think that I can write and put a couple of sentences together. In fact, my youngest daughter, for a Christmas gift last year, got me a typewriter, an old-fashioned Smith & Corona typewriter. God only knows where she found it, but it's exactly like the one I used when I was a student at Syracuse. A little idea how old I am. So we were still using typewriters back in the day. I'm still trying to find out where I'm supposed to get a ribbon for this thing, but I used to write like crazy on that thing, and I keep a journal. I'd keep a daily journal and write a lot. My wife thinks I should be writing a book right now, which might not be a bad idea. I don't know who would read it, but that's every author's nightmare, I guess. But we live right down the street from one of the greatest authors in America today, Dan Brown, here in Rye, New Hampshire. Angels and Demons and Da Vinci Code and all that. He's one of our neighbors. Now, he can flat write. I think the rest of us are just pretending, but I pretend okay.
So, Dave, my last question for you on this podcast, what's been one of your most proudest career moments up to this moment in time?
Well, I've been really lucky. I think that, to be in the booth for so many great Red Sox moments and seasons, I am endlessly fortunate for that. But I think, and I've called 7 women's Final Fours, most of those involving the University of Connecticut. But I think probably, being in the booth for a World Series clincher, as I was in 2013 on radio with Joe Castiglione, I would put that at the very top because that was a sensational run by the Red Sox. It was an unexpected run. They weren't supposed to be that good in 2013. That band of brothers, those bearded guys, they all came together and pulled it off. And what David Ortiz did all season long, and then he hit an incredible home run in the American League Championship Series, which is a call that I'm very, very proud of. But also, beating the Tigers and then beating St. Louis and being at the microphone when the Red Sox clinched at Fenway Park. It's tough to beat that. It's tough to beat the sound of Fenway Park filled to the very top on an October night and the Red Sox winning the World Series at home. First time in about 100 years they had done that. So if you're forcing me to say one moment, and I've been really fortunate to do a lot of different things, it would have to be that.
Well, Dave, thanks so much again for taking the time to come on this podcast today. I know you are Twitterless, but Howie Rose just joined Twitter this past weekend. He has some extra time on his hands.
Howie did this week.
Yes. Is it possible that we see Dave O'Brien join Twitter in the near future?
I guess it's possible, but I tell people this who ask me this question. Why? How come you're not on Twitter? How come you're not on social media? And I say, well, number one, I've got a microphone a lot of the time. That's what I consider Twitter for me. If I want to say something, I've got a microphone, 162 nights a year with the Red Sox and another 40 or 50 doing football and basketball. So I think people have plenty of me. I know I would consider that plenty of Dave O'Brien. So I don't know if I need another platform necessarily. And I get a chance to come on with you and we get a chance to talk about broadcasting and sports. So I think that's plenty. I don't need any more for myself. I'll put it that way. And I'm pretty darn sure nobody else does.
Well, Dave, thanks again for coming on today. I greatly appreciate it.
Great to see you, Alex.